It's a joint effort between HealthTech Nordic and these are the partners that we collaborate with, and here are the channels that we usually use to communicate. And for this special topic, we have a dedicated Slack channel that I'm trying to get some energy into, thanks to these seminars as well. So as Ilona and Kari said, if you have any questions, please reach out. I'm the typically moderator of that channel. There is a few questions now and then there, but I think you can use it more efficiently, and everybody that's listening to this after the live session also bear that in mind. That's a good channel to ask questions, and I can relay it to lean interest, or we have other experts in the network as well that we can reach out to. So next slide, please.
Yes, and this is about
there is also this is a part of a program. We actually have the entries tool, which is a digital tool to assess your product and see if it is a medical device at all, and if it is, you can get the classification done. I wouldn't say in minutes, even though it might be what you promote it as, but at least you get a rough idea pretty quickly, and then you can seek other expertise. You can listen to these educational sessions, or you can reach out to the HealthTech Nordic business advisor that you feel in the partner that you're attached to, and you can get a more in-depth expert to evaluate your problems or check your specific needs. And following this link is also something that we mentioned in all of these sessions. There is we have tried to bundle all the information about what's in it for the partners. We have partners also that are free to use this tool, for example, and listen to this education. We have startups, and we also have something that we call associated partners in the HealthTech Nordic, and all the information for you guys is under the link, and you can feel free to contact me or Lean Entries directly to negotiate or to get a deal or whatever. Maybe it's free, because we have a lot of things free in the HealthTech Nordic community as well. So that's all for me. It's a packed schedule as always, I imagine. I have to pop out around from 10 to almost 11, but I will be back for the last session and see if you still going strong.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Markus. And about the entries tool, it's also good to explore the tool a little bit, so then play around with that, either with the medical device or product idea, or then some arbitrary just to play around, because it's helping you, and there's references to the medical device regulation, and it's kind of the nice learning tool in terms of the MDR regulation. Alternatively, you can read the regulation, but the more you read, so then one tends to become a little bit numb with the regulation and a bit confused. So then it's when playing around with the entries tool, so it's probably a good learning tool as well, with some testing some ideas, and what if I change this one, and what if my device is that one. So then that probably helps in practical approach to get familiar with medical device regulation. Right, so we go to today's topics. So then we have shared it to two parts. So first one is the biological safety, and the second one is electrical safety. And about practical issues, so then it's around 1 hour, the first part, and then we have a short break and some space for discussion and questions. And then we continue with the electrical safety part. And of course, during the presentation, you can type in your questions either in the questions and answer tool, or then the chat. But then please remember to share your chat to all of the attendees, not only to panelists, so that we can then respond to those. And we have two of us here, at least in the beginning, so then we can pick up the your questions from the chat or Q&A session. But on we go with the presentation. So then when we talk about biological and electrical safety, so then these are the issues. So then this is actually the contents of the today's education, of course. So this is the MDR and regulation, IVD regulation perspective. So then where it is told and what is told in the regulation, so then why we need to do this. And then we briefly look at the ISO 10993 series of standards. So then what is the components of the standard family, and then how should you start elaborating that when starting doing the biological safety evaluation. And so then the approach is pretty much from risk management perspective. So then whenever we are developing a new product and designing a new product, so then risk management is in the core. So then, and so it's in the core in assessing the biological safety as well. So the biological safety is part of the verification you need to do during the design, and it's intended that biological safety assessment gives you some ideas about some possible risks related to your product idea or to the product which is under the development. And then hopefully it directs a little bit and guides you through the design and helps you to choose better alternatives, which can then make the finished product more safe and still retaining the efficiency in terms of the performance at the patient. And lastly, there's some talk about these external service providers for biological testing. So then lately there has been some mergers and acquisitions, and number of companies has gone dramatically down. Previously in Europe we had something like 10 to 15 or even 20 service providers. In today I think there's less than 10, maybe only 5 major players on European continent. And Ilona will then present more in detail this issue about this electrical safety. Right. If we look at the medical device life cycle, so then this you probably recall from the previous presentations. So then there is a product idea. You have some kind of the idea. Okay, this is something I would like to convert into a finished product and then launch it on the market on some day. And then, and of course, this kind of the timeline continues. After the launch, there will be some changes to the device to be taken care, and also the risk assessment and biological safety issues could be there as well. So there is one slide about this. But this is the stage when you should plan and carry out the safety tests. So then during the design, and this might sound a little bit like repeating the same old story. So then the earlier you consider certain issues, so then better you can run through the design and development, and then avoid some kind of the pitfalls during the design and the occasions that you should probably go back a couple of steps, and well, probably not to square one, but some of the previous squares, and then redesign your design. But basically, so then if there is something already in the feasibility studies, when you are doing the technical feasibility and market feasibility, so then it's very helpful if you can already recognize and identify biologically safe ways of doing your device in as early stage as possible. And about the biological safety, so then, as promised, so then there's first this regulative perspective. So then, what does the regulation tell about the biological safety? So then, and no matter whether it's some skin on skin surface like this oximeter, pulse oximeter, mobile kind of the handheld device there, or if it's something like it's implanted in the wrist. So then this applies, and this approach and requirements for biological safety that applies to all of the device classes. So, and very first of the annexes in the medical device regulation. So then it's about the general safety and performance requirements. So and where the whole story starts is that manufacturers should design the devices so that they are safe and effective. So this is kind of the stating that whatever you need to do in order to ensure the safety and efficacy of your device, so then that you should plan, and then that should you carry out in terms of the well-planned tests. And moreover, so then Annex 1 as well, these general safety and performance requirements, it is about biocompatibility. So then there are clause 10 in the annex, or section 10 in the Annex 1, that states about the chemical, physical, and biological properties. And again, it's repeated here that the design should be done in a way, and also the design of the manufacturing process should be designed in a way that the manufacturer can ensure that characteristics and performance requirements are fulfilled. And particular attention should be paid to choice of the materials, as I mentioned already previously, and especially what comes to the toxicity. And well, this is quite a rare issue, but of course the electrical medical devices, when they have got some electrical functions, they are connected to the current. So then of course you should consider whether these flammability issues are relevant. And when we talk about biocompatibility, we talk about the compatibility between materials and substances and the biological tissues where the interactions can be either the direct or then indirect contact. For example, you could have a pharmaceutical package or steroid package. You store your device there to be, for example, applied topically on skin or then implanted. But so then the packaging material, if it's in the contact, if that is in the direct contact to the device, so then that makes it that it's going to be in indirect contact to the biological tissues. So then you should then consider the extractables and leachables from the packaging material to the medical device, which is going to be used topically or implanted or otherwise. And so this there's also a list of these ADME abbreviation, how it's typically referred. So then whenever it's relevant to your device, you should also consider whether there's something that could be absorbed to the body, there's something that could be distributed in the body. Maybe if it's slowly degrading polymers or products, so then is there something that could have impact in metabolism of the patient? And then also the excretion system. And this is basically all this what we can find about biological safety is mostly in the MDR. In the diagnostics, it's a bit different story. So then there in the IVDR, so the biological compatibility is mostly spoken in related to this analytical performance, because it's not directly in contact. It can't impact on patient safety as such. But of course, the interpretation of the results and then the kind of the analytical performance could be impacted by the biological compatibility issues. And yet we go on with these MDR requirements, and this is kind of to show you where exactly this biological safety data is located in the technical documentation. And the technical documentation, this kind of the snapshot here, it's exactly according to the requirements of the MDR, and chapter or directory number 6 is about product verification and validation. So this is the area you should then collect all the biological safety data when you submit your technical documentation to notified body and to be reviewed when applying the certification under the MDR requirements or regulation. And this should contain all kind of the results of the tests and animal tests as well, and then also the preclinical safety data, what is collected, what is performed, and what is then collected into the form of the reports in this technical documentation. And there is yet another mention here, which then refers to the biocompatibility, and especially manufacturers should pay attention on the biocompatibility of the device, and then identification of all materials. And this is quite important, so that you really should know in and out your material physically, chemically, and microbiologically. So what is there in your product, so that what is intended to be there, what are the some kind of the trace elements there, or some trace substances which typically comes in small quantities to your product. And then also you should then consider the manufacturing process. Is there something in the manufacturing process that could release some material that is not intended to be in the device, but it will be in very, very low quantities of the device, and for those reasons you should assess their impact on the biological safety as well. And also this contents of the technical documentation that mentions the electrical safety there, but there's more about electrical safety in the second part of today's session. And to mention here, so then MDR also requires that manufacturers should give some statements on whether the devices contain or not contain carcinogenic, mutagenic, or reproduction toxic substances. And if not, so then manufacturers should give kind of the statement with justification. What is the reasoning, and what is the chemical characterization of your material, that you can then state that you should not show any data on these carcinogenic, mutagenic, or toxic to reproduction substances. And two other terms are there in the MDR as well. These endocrine disrupting substances, so the substances can have a kind of the unexpected impact on patients' endocrine system and metabolism. And in the previous version of the European regulations, Medical Device Directive, there was very little about the nanomaterials. It was not so common at that time. But in today's regulation, there is tens of mentions of the nanomaterials, and because they can they can have unexpected effects on biological safety as well. So then a special attention should be paid on nanomaterial as well. Okay, if we go to the standard 10993 series, next. So this is the purpose and scope of the 10993 series of standards. So then the main or primary objective of the standards, and especially requiring that this standard is followed, is that protection of humans from potential biological risks arising from the use of the medical device. And when we talk about use of medical device, it then includes, of course, all the small amounts of the elements and the residues from the manufacturing process as well. You should be aware of, and then either showing some data that they are in the quantities that they are negligible, or then alternatively some data which shows that even though it's analyzed the quantities, but you have got some, on the contrary, you have got some data that shows that in these quantities, it's not causing any unexpected health impacts to the patients. And this 10993 series that sets a framework for biological evaluation of medical devices, and importance is with the word framework. So then it should not taken, okay, well, the standard should be taken literally, but then some expertise and special consideration should be applied there when reading the requirements of the 10993 series. It's only there's a lot of information, but it's only a framework for biological evaluation, and then you as a manufacturer, so that you should be aware of your medical device, and then aware of the mode of the action and types of the use, and how it can impact the human health. And this is all about the risk management process. So then as typically in the normal risk management process, so then it is first to identify the risks, and here also it's to identify the source of the biologically safety issues, and then it's to evaluate those. So then kind of the assessment, and once you have identified and evaluated, so then you need to manage those biological safe issues, and finally all these findings and then the data and the results of the testing should be in the report. And when starting this 10993 series biological evaluation, so then you should use all kind of the data what you have. Probably you have got some data available in the company records, so then you have got some similar devices from the past. There's a lot of information in the scientific articles, for example, some toxicological reviews, and any type of the literature data, and very useful data sources also, currently adverse event databases. For example, US forthe database is open to all users. There's useful data if you manage to find the right keywords. You can do some searches there, and Australian, Brazilian, and then UK databases are also available for the public. Not yet in Europe, but with this MDR and UNIMED database, so then maybe within a few years time from now, so that there is some helpful information for the European manufacturers as well. And then as you go along with this interpretation of the 10993 series, so then you select and apply these tests that are needed to show the biological safety of your device. And that means that you should have done the full evaluation of the biological response, and that is to each medical device or to the component which can have the direct or indirect contact to the patient. And eventually, this is kind of the overall evaluation, and then, as mentioned already previously, so this is in the first, or in the best case, this is guiding the development and enabling the development project to develop a safe and as safe and as possible medical device. And there's one mention. So then, even though we are now briefly browsing through the 10993 series of principles, and there is a lot of information in the series, which is well understandable. But this is emphasized in the standard as well, so that this series of standards, so that should be used and applied by professionals. So because there will be some issues, even though when you are the best expert of your product, so there will be some issues and considerations how to design the tests to show the sufficient data so that it's valid also in the regulation phase. So here at the launch, and especially when you are collecting the technical documentation, so in the first place, it could be that you are happy with the result, and it's according to the standard. But then you should then consider that how this data is evaluated and assessed by notified body experts when they are assessing all points of your and views of your medical device. So then it's probably a good idea to have a short break and stop for a moment when designing these tests, especially if you are working with the high risk devices. There's currently more than 20 parts in this 10993 series of standards, and there's a lot of substandards, and they are giving some detailed instructions how to set up the test in vitro, in vivo, how to design some animal models, and so on. And so there's a lot of information in there as well, but as mentioned, so then also other methods than those mentioned in these parts of the standard are possible, and they should be justified. They might be even needed, especially if you think about that you should get the approval and certify your product according to the MDR. So please think always a bit more more steps in advance. And so then for what purposes the final data package is needed, and then how to design the test and plan the test so that you get the best possible result. But as having said this, so do kind of the message that design tests well and then do a lot of tests. But this ISO 10993/1, so this also encourages to minimize the number and exposure of test animals. So then kind of when you are following the instructions and then searching the data, literature data, scientific articles, and then the data from the raw material providers. So then eventually you should come to the conclusion that how you are able to minimize the number and expose of test animals. This is a nice message as well. And in several cases, especially if you are discussing with a notified body representatives, so they might also be asking, so then is this really needed? And this you can use as a justification in some tests. You can list all the data what you have found, and then you can suggest that, okay, based on this data, it looks like any further animal testing is unnecessary, and it's not justified according to this standard. It's saving of efforts, and it's saving some money as well, because some animal test models can be pretty costly as well. Okay, this all the testing, if necessary, so then that should cover the biological risk both for patient and the user. So then mostly we talk about patient, but if there are some devices or parts of the devices that could have a risk, or that could have a risky handling issues for the user, for the healthcare professional, so they should be taken into account as well in the planning and in the evaluation. And that was already mentioned that this applies the standard and the requirements for the biological safety, that applies to all classes of medical devices. And one important, so then you could in principle do some preliminary testing, and during the feasibility studies, especially some cytotoxicity tests, they are pretty reasonable price tests, so you could do some testing with the prototypes. But then when you collect the data package, the final evaluation should always be done with the final product, which is manufactured with a validated processes, and it's sterilized and it's packaged appropriately. And there's yet to mention that this, due to COVID, this ISO 10993 part 1 is available now free on the ISO.org web pages, because several standards, they have been open now for free access to manufacturers and to other users due to COVID pandemics. This is a small positive impact of this situation for all of us who are designing or somehow related to the development of the medical devices. We will not go in depth to the 10993 series of the substandards or the several parts, but there are some standards to mention. So the first part is the, let's say, the fundamental part, because this you need in the planning stage, and this makes also reference to the risk standard here. And the part number 2, it's a little bit more like for the service providers, so that there are some rules and recommendations for the animal welfare. And this genotoxicity, carcinogenity, and reproductive toxicity was mentioned already previously. So then if you have got a high risk class product, and then this is quite typically needed there as well. And part 4 is about those devices that can have interactions with blood. And part 5, this is the most used part of these substandards, in addition to part 1. So then typically if you don't have the data from your equal or similar devices, so that this is typically what you need to do. And this is on Petri dish, and one test costs something like 200 or 300 euros only. So this is one part which is quite frequently used by medical device developing companies. There are part 6, so about local effects. There is a part 7, which is a special part for the ethylene oxide sterilized parts. There are nowadays a lot of good service providers with this electron beam and then the gamma irradiated sterilization, which is very good alternative to the ethylene oxide sterilization. But ethylene oxide has been a very standard, kind of not golden standard, but very much used. But it also can produce some residuals in the device. So you should done some biological testing and safety testing that you really don't have any ethylene oxide residues in the device. There was something like 10 or 15 years ago, there was one dialysis equipment, and they changed because in dialysis, the kidney patient stays typically a couple of hours to make a full body dialysis of the harmful substances in the blood, which will be filtered with the dialysis, and then the same equipment will be used to the next patient. So then all the internal parts in the device, they need to be sterilized between the patients. And there was one device which was using ultraviolet sterilization, but then they changed to the ethylene oxide sterilization. And it ended up so that the biological safety of the dialysis equipment was not done according to the regulation, and there were some small residues of that, if I remember correctly. So then few patients, they injured very dramatically, and I think one or two patients even died due to these residues of the ethylene oxides. So that was during the MDD directive era. So then hopefully now in future, so these type of the flaws or errors wouldn't be possible anymore. And there's part 9 about the decoration products. And in addition to the cytotoxicity test, so then this part 10 test for irritation and skin sensitization is also widely used. This irritation test has been quite recently replaced by the part 23, the next page. But sensitization tests are still here in the part 10. And then there's a part 11 for systemic toxicity, especially if you have some long-term implant. And part 12 is then giving some advices how to prepare the sample and which reference materials to use. Of course, when there's these subparts, so they can, in their terms, they can present some very precise sample preparation and method descriptions as well. And this list goes on, and I only mention here this leachable, which is part 16, and then the chemical characterization of the material, because this, if you are not aware of your materials, if you don't know exactly what you have put in and what are the raw materials and what are the, let's say, the small residues that is present in your material, so then you should do the chemical characterization. And this chemical characterization is a part you can hardly avoid in today's world. So then whenever you collect the data for your medical device, so then you should have some chemical characterization data for your product. And this, I mentioned this part 23, so tests for irritation in vitro, in vivo, or in silico computational chemistry as well could be an alternative for that. Right. Okay. And if we go now to the implementation of the 10993, so then how to do the risk approach and how to categorize your device. So then first you categorize your device according to the function and then the contact to the skin, if it's like a short-term contact or is it in a direct contact or indirect contact. And there are few rules in this. Since you are developing your product, you probably already know how it's going to be used, and this is a pretty straightforward task. I just quickly present which kind of the surface contacts there could be. It could be like skin contact, like electrodes or some monitors you need to attach on patient skin, and especially the intact skin, so that it's non-compromised and healthy skin, and it's in the skin contact only. It could be a longer period of time. It could be a short period of time, like taking the EKG cardiograph. And the contact to the surfaces could be also to the mucosal membranes, like contact lenses, catheters, bronchoscopes, and some dental prostheses. They are in contact to gingiva and then the mucosa in mouth. And the contact could be also to compromised skin. For example, some dressing and wound healing patches or plasters. And then second categorization there is that externally communicating medical devices, like administration of solutions or administration of blood outside of the patient. So then there's one category there, indirect blood that, and it could be like tissue, bone, dentin, or delivery of fluids to the tissue or bone. That's the second category. Like skin staples, given as an example here. And it could be like intravascular catheters that contact is in the blood vessels. Or in today's situation, pandemics, so there's this breathing assisting devices, this oxygenated tubing, which are needed for the serious COVID patients as well. And then the dialysis, as I already mentioned, as an example for one failure several years ago with these biological safety issues. And the categories could be like bone implants as well, body pins, pacemakers. It could be directly in circulating blood like pacemaker electrodes on surface of the vascular surfaces, and then vascular grafts are in this category as well. And a second categorization is according to the exposure time. So if we always talk about single, multiple, or repeated duration. So if you can accumulate the duration during the typical mode of use of your medical device, so that it's still considered a limited exposure if it's up to 24 hours. It's category B, a prolonged exposure, if this sum of single, multiple, or repeated duration exceeds 24 hours, but it doesn't exceed 30 days. And then all these long-term exposures, like which is more than 1 month, typically pacemakers, and also the very low risk class, like okay, now it's winter time and it could be like slippery outside, so then all these plaster of Paris and all these external support when you get the bone fracture and you get some casting on your foot or then on your arm. So they are very often, the time exceeds 30 days, their treatment, even though they are in low risk class. This was already mentioned that, and this comes a couple of times in the standard, that it's all about the risk management in the biological evaluation as well, and it should follow the principles of a risk standard 14971. And in this evaluation, so then these are the considerations to be taken into account. So then you should know your device. So then what is the configuration, for example, size, geometry, or surface properties. For example, if the surface is smooth or if it's a rough surface, it could cause some further considerations. And also, for example, if your device contains some sharp edges or rough surfaces, and if you look at it with a microscope, for example, it's having some kind of this small kind of the geographical forms there. You should consider this also in the biological testing, because some of the tests, such as cytotoxicity, so there are at least there are 3 alternatives how to do their cytotoxicity. You can place your device directly on top of the cell culture, and if it's a rough surface, so that it could easily happen so that the gentle pressure which is caused by your device on the cell culture then is not cytotoxic as such. It is not releasing any substances which are toxic to these cells which are on the petri dish, but the roughness of the surface then punctures the cells, and then the contents of the cells are bursted from the cells, and then when the laboratory reads the results, so then the result, according to results, it shows that it's cytotoxic, even though there wouldn't be any releasing substances which are making any harms to the cells. But this should be taken into account there as well, because the 2 other alternatives are that you are not, for example, able to test your product directly on top of the cell culture. So then one way is to extract. You are extracting with some solvents or water, ethanol, hexane, your device, and then you are administering this extract in water solution on top of the mouse cell culture. And third one is that you got some kind of the semi-permeable layer in between, some agar layer, for example, on top of the cells, and then you place your device on top of that agar layer. There are these alternatives, and then the service provider, when you're discussing with the service provider, so they should know which one applies to your device, so that not making any dummy conclusions that so this is the way how we do it, and then you are in a kind of the trouble if you get at the first place you get some false negative results or false positive results that it is cytotoxic, even though it isn't by nature. And also you should consider these characteristics and composition of your device, and then any history of clinical use. And as mentioned already previously, so then really you should, it's advised to use some time for reviewing all the possible toxicological data and biological safety data, what is to be found for the product or then for the related products. And yet the list goes on, and then this list what other issues should be taken into account. So this makes a reference to the parts of this 10993 standard. So then here again, it's mentioned these leachable substances, which is then referring to the these parts 17 and 18, and degradation products you should be testing, and you should be taking into account the packaging materials you're using. Are they in direct or in indirect contact with the medical device? So then some of the packaging material you can neglect, but you need to present all the materials and all the components of your device in the biological evaluation, and then those parts which are not in contact to the medical device could be left out of the evaluation and test plan. But you would need to justify that and then show that this part can never contaminate the part which is going to be in contact with a patient. and what all other components there are in your device. So then you should take into account those and the physical characteristics. And this is also so then not only the shape and the granularity or roughness of the device, but also the porosity could be important to take into account, especially when calculating the contact surface of your device to the final biological application. And for reusable devices, so then if they have got some limitations, so then how many times they could be sterilized or reused, so then that should be taken into account in the planning or test as well. And this yet again mentions that chemical characterization that should always precede any biological testing, and eventually the benefit should outweigh the risks. So then, even though you have tested successfully that your device is biocompatible, but it could very well be that it's not 100% irritation free. So there are always some unexpected reactions with some sensitive patients. So then you might have got some sensitization reaction, even though your device was tested to be non-sensitizing in the biocompatibility testing. And this is something to be followed in the post-market phase of your product. So this is kind of the summarizing the test here. So then the categories by nature, surface, external, implant, and duration that we handled already. And there's a table in this 10993 standard, which is helping then the manufacturers to get at least a big picture of so what all tests are needed, and either in terms of the applicable data, or then in terms of the new data to be reproduced. And then from this standard, there is one annex in the standard. It gives you a very good advice on how to do the biological evaluation plan. And if you have got skilled R&D and technically oriented people, so you could do this as well by yourself, but most likely when doing the biological evaluation plan, you would need some help from the service providers who are used to make these biological evaluation plans, and which are then kind of the valid and solid evidence also for the stages when you need to apply the market approval. And here's once more mentioned the risk-based approach that first define, characterize your material and identify hazards, and then you identify the chemicals that could be released and estimate the exposure times to the patients, and also the chemicals that could be from the processing stages. Processing stages if they are in contact with some processing instruments, or degradation products, for example, if you are applying some irradiation, and there will be some degradation of the polymers, for example. So then these side products and unintended degradation products you should take into account in these estimates and assessments as well. And then eventually it's reviewing the toxicological and other biological safety data what is available there. So then when done all this, so this is then what you get out of the process is the biological evaluation report, and this is the interpretation of all the data what you have successfully collected, and there's probably some recommendations for other additional tests needed in order to show and demonstrate the biological safety. And also it's making the overall biological safety conclusions. And if suggesting, for example, some additional testing, so this standard quite clearly states that all the additional testing should be conducted in the following order. That first do some more physical and chemical characterization, but if that is assessed that it won't be bringing you any new information, so then apply in vitro testing in laboratory, Petri, this test tube, whatsoever. And then eventually, if you can't avoid any animal testing, so then that is a choice. And so the conclusion and kind of even though it's mentioned here that the report then states the need for the additional test, but the outcome of the report could also be that no further testing is needed. And this is even for the complex and high risk class product. This is the case if, for example, a company is extending the production line, and then you already have got a lot of information, and you can show that the degradation products, for example, and the processing residues, they are the same for this new product. And then the conclusion could very well be that no further testing is needed. This is a lot stable. So then once done, categorization. So then these are the endpoints, expected endpoints for the test. And here in the table for these various categories, which is like surface medical devices, externally communicating medical devices, and implantable medical devices, in all these various groups and categories. So then we can see that at least this test package is very often needed. Cytotoxicity, sensitization, and then irritation or intracutaneous reactivity. This is a test package typically we can't avoid. And the more risks there are, and the more contacts, and the more sensitive tissue areas in human and in the patient, so then the more test package you need there as well. But this is then to be done together with your service provider. But this table, at least in this annex of 10993, helps you in the design phase to make some estimates on what is the test, what is the most probable test package you would need when doing the biological safety assessment. And should there be some changes in your device at later stages, so this 10993 gives you also very good help in terms of the decision tree. So then you start here. So if that is the very first question is here, is there's a direct or indirect patient to contact? If there isn't, so then you're safe that this doesn't apply. But then you go on here, so then can you find what is the physical and chemical information you can find there, and then it's kind of giving you then the guidelines and the obligations. What is the additional testing you need? But also this gives you justifications in the cases you won't need any additional testing. For example, if the material is the same as you are already marketing in the device, and the same formulation, for example, and you know the biological safety issues for that substance and that device on the market already. So then you can skip the next stages here. But this is kind of the nice decision tree to go through, and it's very helpful, especially if there are some changes in the processes. For example, as I mentioned, so then this change of the sterilization method from UV sterilization to ethylene oxide sterilization. There might be some different residues in the device or in the use of the device that really should be analyzed. Okay, and eventually there's a couple of slides about these external service providers for testing. I already mentioned that these test laboratories quite recently they have merged very much together in Europe. There are a couple of well, 2, 3, maybe 5 laboratories in Europe available for these testings, and it's quite simple to use US-based test laboratories also. Personally, I haven't been using any Indian or Chinese laboratories, but I know that there are some laboratories there on the market as well. If they are accredited and reliable, and they can show the data and some reference to the other companies that have been using their services, so then they could be as good as well. But so then, as already mentioned, so then this biological evaluation, it should be done by a person who is competent in doing this, some person at your company who is familiar with this, at least having some scientific basics. But then also one key question is that what is the competence and what is the, let's say, the expertise at your service provider, and what is the expertise and the competence you would need for your device at the service provider. For example, if you need some animal models, they're most likely, it's at least preferred if the expert at the service provider is a vet, for example. That helps in designing the applicable animal models there. Even though there are several parts in the standard, but some of the tests, so they need to be designed very specifically to your product only. And you probably need some expertise in chemical characterization, some methods, matrices, extractions, or you need some special equipment, for example, ICP, mass spectroscopy, or some XRF methods for searching some elemental or making some elemental analysis. And especially if you need to do some calculation for toxicological calculation at your service provider, you probably would need to have a person who has got some statistical know-how, and most likely a toxicologist. But to my experience, so then toxicological expertise is not typically present at service providers. They might have got some expertise, but for some toxicological reports, you would need these certified toxicologists, either European certified toxicologist or then US certified, and there's a certain kind of the exam and certificate for those people, and they are very often in the other companies and providing the business-to-business services to these. So they are a very good person to talk to if you think about how to assess the toxicological impact of your device. And it's very good if it's let's say the established company, it's been in the business for a long time, and they can show that they have had this kind of the similar testing previously without giving any proprietary information, but they could give some names of the reference companies. It's a good sign there as well. And also So then rely on expertise at companies, but also check the competence and expertise of the service provider. And then even though done all this here previously, so then when you get the quotation and the test plan, please review it carefully and then double check the test procedure. So does it sound rational to you as well? So then, and what might be the pitfalls there? And lastly, so then I haven't been doing recently any service laboratory research for biological testing, but these are the prices from 10 years ago. My guess is that due to the mergers and acquisitions, these are pretty much the same. So then some tests like cytotoxicity, it could be still here in 150 euros because laboratories they have merged together and they can provide very cost-effective services. And for the irritation test, there are now a couple of nice new models. So this is pretty much the same, to my understanding, the price level here. Sensitization, there are mouse cell models which are on Petri dish models, and they are at least 10 years ago they were quite expensive as compared to the normal guinea pig animal models. But as we learned already today, so then animal tests should be avoided as much as possible. So then preferably do that in the test tube and on the Petri dish than in animals if possible. But this gives you some idea about this elementary package you would need when doing the biological testing for your product. Okay, I think we have now covered the first part of the presentation. So then if there are any questions or considerations or arise discussion at this point, so we can take that, or we can have a short break and then come with some questions after the break before we start with this electrical safety part of today's session. Right. So then, if no questions or in the chat or in the Q&A session so far, so then we can do before the break. We can do the short polling for you. So then, having heard now this, so then those who are still there online, so then if you are planning the device, or if you are having the product idea, for example, so then do you know already that your device is in direct or indirect contact with a patient or other end user? It could be also that you don't know it in advance. And this was the result. So then at least those who are now present in the live session, so then they know that they do have got some biological safety assessment ahead of their design and development. And another question is that a little bit like hearing about your experience in this field. So then if you haven't been involved in the biological evaluation of biocompatibility, so then you can pick up this none. Or if you are familiar with some basic biocomp data, so then you can check the second box. Or if you are a little bit more experienced at you are familiar or you have been involved in in applying the several parts. So that's also one option. But at least none of the attendees have had a key role in biological evaluation. And if we share the results, this is now the poll result available. Right. Okay, I think we are done with the first part. It's then up to Ilona to.
So, is your device an electromedical device covered by IEC 60601 standard series? So, if you know, answer yes or no. If you're not sure, that is okay as well, if you're not familiar with the definition yet. Okay, everyone actually already answered, and we have one of each answer. So one electromedical device, one that is not, and one participant is not sure. And then, do you have any experience on IEC 60601 standard series? So either none, or you might be familiar with it. You might have used it to apply requirements for electrical safety and EMC, or you might also be familiar with other safety standard. For example, IEC 62368 is for ICT and audiovisual equipment for consumer products. And then there's one option that is other. And everyone answered. There are 2 people with no experience on the standard and one other, and now I'm curious what that means. So if you want, you can write in chat. But let's continue with the, or get started with the presentation. Just one moment, so I'll set up the sharing. Okay, so electrical safety, or well, that's perhaps a misleading title. It's safety for electromedicals, so it's much more than just electrical safety, but for electric medical devices. So we'll go over the 60601 series of standards and its scope and applicability, and then how to find the right collateral and particular standards, and also what those are, if you haven't heard of those before. And just an intro into how to get started with this standard series. Then we'll go over some key concepts like essential performance, and there are multiple parts in the standard where you need to classify your product according to certain definition, and then the requirements depend on that classification. So we'll go over a couple of examples regarding that one, and also some basics about electromagnetic compatibility, so EMC, which is also very relevant for electrical medical devices. So first about the IEC 60601 series. So the name of the first standard in the series is Medical Electrical Equipment, Part 1, General Requirements for Basic Safety and Essential Performance. And the structure of the series is depicted there. So there's first of all the general standard for all electrical medical devices. So that is 60601-1. So that is the place to get started. Then there are these collateral standards. So 60601-1-something. So those are sort of use cases. Then there are also particular standards for different device types and technologies. And the standard numbering here goes so that they are -2, -something. Then there are also technical reports. So these are guidance documents, interpretations. I'm not very familiar with most of these. I think I haven't applied any of them in practice, but definitely helpful in some situations. And what the standard series, what the main principles are, is that you have to apply these principles in device design. You have to do risk management and include them in the risk management file. And then you also need to do some testing ultimately. But it cannot be emphasized enough how important part of risk management file this is. So you cannot just send your device for testing and get the report back. That won't be enough. Whereas for some other types of devices than medical devices, it's not exactly how the process goes, but more closely. And then you might have seen different variations of the standard number. So you might have seen EN 60601-1 and then also IEC and the same number. So what is the difference of these? So IEC is the international version of the standard, but then EU has decided that they will not be making their own standards, but instead they are using these IEC standards, and then they are adding this Annex Z, or it also could be Annex ZA, ZB, something like that, but you'll recognize it from the Z. And that basically tells that how it conforms to the MDD requirements, for example, and then to MDR requirements when they start harmonizing these to MDR. But the contents is the same. So if you have been reading the IEC version, that is completely fine. Okay, and here the structure of the standard series is put into pictures. So we have the general standard on the left, and to the right, it's still -1, but the number after that starts rising. So that's the collateral standards. Then the particular standards are here below. So those are -2, -something. And as you might notice from this one, there are also these IEC 80601 standards, but those are also particular standards. I will discuss about that difference or why it is so in a bit. And then the technical reports, but really this general standard, collateral and particular standards are the key here. So you should be looking at those. And then a few words about the scope. So the main standard, the -1 standard, says that it applies to basic safety and essential performance of medical electrical equipment and medical electrical systems. So ME equipment and ME systems, those abbreviations are used throughout the standard. And it also says that this can be applied to equipment used for compensation or alleviation of disease, injury, or disability. So on top of those medical uses. But in vitro diagnostic equipment, so if you have these laboratory equipment that go under IVDR and not MDR, those do not fall within the definition here. So there's a different standard series. It's IEC 61010. So the numbers are in different order, but the difference is substantial. And the standard also doesn't apply to implantable parts of active implantable medical devices. So implantable devices that also have active properties or are using electricity, basically. So those are covered by ISO 14708 because those are very different from other electromedicals. And the definition of medical electrical equipment is on this slide. So exactly as it said in the standard. So basically electrical equipment having an applied part or transferring energy to or from the patient or detecting such energy transfer to or from the patient. And also it must only have one, not more than one connection to a particular supply mains. Of course, it might have 0 if it's battery operated. And it must be intended for diagnosis, treatment, or monitoring, or compensation or alleviation of disease, injury, or disability. So these are about basically the medical device definitions in the regulation or directive. And ME equipment includes also accessories that are defined by manufacturer to be necessary to enable the normal use. So this could be an adapter, for example, or any other like tubing, wires, anything like that. So basically, if you have accessories, remember to include those in the design for electrical safety and in the testing. And then there's also a definition of medical electrical systems. So this, on the other hand, is a combination of items of equipment, at least one of which is medical electrical equipment. So this is a wider concept. So if you have multiple different equipment in your setup, you might even have some that are not medical. You might have a laptop computer or things like that, but these form an ME system. And why is it important? It's because some clauses in the standard apply to medical electrical equipment, so those must fulfill some requirements, but then there are also these requirements for the whole medical electrical systems. So for example, interconnectivity. But it applies to both unless it is stated that this is only for ME systems, for example, like in the title of one of those chapters. And then to visualize this a little bit better, this would be an example of ME system. This is directly from the standard, by the way. So here we have a system that includes ECG module that is connected to a personal computer. Then we have patient cable, and then we have well, maybe another connector or some kind of or of course it might be that the cable is just one cable that is divided into 3, but there could also be a part that you can take off. But in any case, there are ECG electrodes as well. So here the manufacturer would specify that what are the roles inside this system. So is this a system? Is the ME equipment, is it the ECG module and patient cable, for example, and ECG electrodes, or do you want to divide that further? Is there multiple ME equipment? Or you could also define that this whole thing, including the computer, is an equipment. So it depends on you. Probably the easiest way is to consider this as the system and, for example, leave the computer out of the picture when talking about the ME equipment. But there is no, not just one correct way of dividing this into ME equipment and defining what is one ME equipment. So that's perhaps the key takeaway here. And there is also the term applied parts on this slide, but we'll get back to this picture and talk about that then. So then, as I mentioned, that there are multiple collateral and particular standards. So how do you then determine the applicable ones? So you also always use this -1 standard as the basis if you have defined that it is an ME equipment or system in your device. Then you would determine the collateral standards for your device, and then you would determine the particular standards based on the device technology. And how to do this? Well, the name of the standard is a good indication of what it's about, but then if you have to check further, you're not sure if it applies to your device, also check the scope. And there might be some terms and definitions, so usually written, if it's written in capital letters, you will find a definition in the terms and definitions section of the standard. So check those and see that does your device fit into this description. And of course, there might be also some non-medical device specific standards that apply, like lithium-ion batteries. If you're using those have their own standards. And then about collateral standards. So basically there are two very basic standards that should pretty much always be required, be considered. So if it's an electrical medical device, you will most likely have to consider electromagnetic compatibility, so EMC. And that is such a big thing that I have dedicated a couple of slides in the end of this presentation to that topic. But the other one is usability. So that is -6 of the collateral standards. And I think that you already, we had the usability session already. So as was stated here, this standard doesn't have much content, so it's mostly refers to 62368, which is the main usability engineering standard. But in any case, this applies to your device. Other collateral standards that need to be considered case by case, that is this applicable, radiation protection in diagnostic X-ray equipment, alarm systems, so if you have any alarms in your device, environmentally conscious design, which is for some reason only required in Brazil. So if you're going with the Anvisa certification, you will need to take this standard into use, but for some reason it's not required in, for example, EU. Physiologic closed loop controllers, and then devices used in home healthcare environment. So this -11 standard for home healthcare environment is quite common. So if you're doing anything that is for home use, potentially consider this as well. And then -12 is emergency medical equipment. Then particular standards. So there are both 60601-2- something and 80, same numbers, standards, and those are both particular standards. And they have been, the ones beginning with 6 have been made by IEC, and the ones beginning with 8 have been made in collaboration with ISO. So that is the difference here. And multiple particular standards can apply. So if you found one, that doesn't mean that there aren't others. And there are particular standards for things like ECG, EEG, X-ray units, MR equipment, then, for example, dental, intraoral X-ray, infusion pumps, medical beds. So a wide kind of a selection of devices. And basically, if they have some specific properties for which it has been decided that the basic standard cannot really be applied fully, or if they need extra means of protection. That is why particular standards have been created for some of these devices. And they can modify, replace, or delete requirements from the main standard, and may add other basic safety and essential performance requirements as well. And these particular standards, the requirements also always take priority over requirements of the main standard. And if you have a collateral and particular standard that exist, then a particular standard also takes priority over the collateral standard. And how to find a list of these standards? Well, if you look at a harmonized standard list, that has some, but unfortunately that has for a long while been missing some of the standards. Hopefully MDR, once they get the harmonization going, perhaps it will fix this, perhaps it won't. One option is also to look in standards like IEC webshop and search for standards with the starting with 60601 or 880. So that is one option, but unfortunately there is not really a kind of a good 100% up-to-date list that can be provided for this, and it's of course a situation that is constantly changing. And just a reminder again about what was already mentioned here. So standard applicability and priority order is first the particular standard, then the collateral standard, and then the general standard if same requirement is discussed in those three. And here is the table of contents of the general standard. So it's a good place to start when first looking into this. So first 3 chapters are generic standard things like scope, normative references, terminology. And as I said, if you're looking into if a particular standard is applicable, these are very important because that will, the scope really helps define if your device goes there or not. Then general requirements is it's probably the best chapter to start because it gives detailed descriptions about, for example, link to risk management. So things that you really need to know to get started with the standard series. Chapter 5 is about general requirements for testing. Chapter 6 gets you started on classification of ME equipment and ME systems. So some of those classifications that you will need to do and that affect the coming chapters, because here if you classify that your device is one category or is not in one category, then when you are reading the requirements later on, if it says that it's only for this and this, then you know immediately that do you need to even read this chapter. Chapter 7 contains multiple requirements regarding identification, marking, documentation, so instructions for use, for example. Then the next chapter is next chapters are about specific hazards and how devices should meet those. So they contain, some of those contain very specific things that you need to test, for example. So electrical hazards, mechanical hazards, radiation hazards, temperatures, and of course, some of these might not apply to your device. You might know already looking at the title, like chapter 14, is your device programmable electrical medical system, or does it have such functionality? So if you know right away that it doesn't, then it's not applicable. But do keep in mind that, for example, radiation contains lasers. So if you have a laser to position the patient to X-ray device, for example, well, that might have other radiation hazards as well. But even if it's something that doesn't really have any other kind of radiation, but it has some kind of pointer laser, then you need to look into this anyway. So keep that in mind and do not rule anything out too quickly. And unless it's otherwise specified, requirements apply in normal use and in reasonably foreseeable misuse. And if there are in the standard or any of the standards, particular collateral as well, if they specify verifiable requirements that address particular risks. So if they have, for example, a test for a certain mechanical hazard, and you have complied with this standard, and the test result is okay, then you can assume that it's okay unless there is some objective evidence to the contrary. So you don't need to then think about that any further. And alternative means of addressing some risks are acceptable. The standard does state that, but you should only use this if you have a very good reason to use this clause. So if you have a very kind of a complicated device in the way that you see, for example, a temperature hazard, and it just doesn't make sense that your device shouldn't go over certain temperature limits, and or that mechanical hazard tests aren't applicable. So this is an option, but usually it's easier to go with the standard requirements and the test, unless there's very good reason not to. And it actually looks like the text from the previous slide is here twice, but I think that there was some kind of editing error, but the last point here is new. So compliance is checked by inspection of risk management file. So also you must be mindful that you must establish a risk management process. You must have established that what is acceptable level of risk. You must have taken everything into account from the standard that needs to be taken into account in risk management, and sometimes the how you handle the risk can just be that you are doing design according to 60601. And as was stated, if there's a verifiable means of knowing that it's okay, it can be presumed that the risk is then on acceptable level. And then you must also demonstrate that residual risk is acceptable. And essential performance is one of the key concepts. So as was mentioned, it is in the standard name, general requirements for basic safety and essential performance. So what is it? It's it's basically, sorry. Yeah, it's basically performance that is necessary to achieve freedom from unacceptable risk. So that is the definition from the standard. But the standard also acknowledges that this is not a very good definition and says that it's most easily understood by considering whether absence or degradation of this performance would result in an unacceptable risk. So the requirements are that the manufacturer shall identify which functions of ME equipment or systems are essential performance. And then there are places in the standard where it says that essential performance is to be maintained following a particular test. So yeah, and failure of essential performance can be either lack of performance or incorrect performance. And it's good to note that your device might or might not have functions that fit this criteria. So not all electrical medical devices have this kind of essential performance. But on the other hand, if you do have essential performance in your device, you might have multiple functions. So it's maybe not just one, but because there are those tests that were mentioned that say that essential performance is to be maintained following a particular test, then do note that if you have multiple functions that you defined as essential performance, you will have to do these tests that many times. So it increases the complexity of testing quite a lot. So do consider carefully that is this essential performance or not. If you have, for example, identified that you have 5 functions that fit this criteria, then perhaps consider this again. But that is, of course, possible depending on how high risk class your device has as well. And these are from the Annex A of the standard. So these are examples of essential performance. So it could be accuracy of a life-supporting function or correct administration of a drug by a syringe pump, and where inaccuracy or incorrect administration would cause an unacceptable risk to the patient. Second example is ability of an electrocardiograph or monitor to recover from the effects of the discharge of a defibrillator. And here as well, failure to recover could lead to an incorrect response by the medical staff that would present an unacceptable risk to the patient. So the formula here is that there is always something that would present an unacceptable risk to the patient. It could also be correct operation of an alarm in an intensive care or operating room monitoring system, where incorrect or missing alarm could lead to an incorrect response by the medical staff that would present an unacceptable risk to the patient. So again, correct operation of an alarm could often be essential performance, but only if those devices are in functions like this. So not, of course, if it's a empty battery alarm by a heartbeat monitor that is not used, that is used for sports or things like that. Although that's kind of a borderline case anyway. Some of those can be medical devices and some cannot. Also correct output of diagnostic information from ME equipment that is likely to be relied upon to determine treatment. And again, incorrect information could lead to inappropriate treatment, and that could lead to unacceptable risk to the patient. And of course, risk management file is in a very key role here to determine that what is an unacceptable risk and what is not. Also, term single fault condition is presented by the standard, and they say that requirement must be fulfilled in a normal condition or single fault condition. So some requirements say this. And this ME equipment has to be designed and manufactured so that it remains single fault safe or risk remains acceptable in those cases. And here are more definitions about when ME equipment is considered single fault safe, but I'm not going to go through those in detail, but just for future reference. And then some of the ME equipment classifications or some general knowledge about them first, and then a couple of examples on the following slides. So classification is important because it affects very heavily which types of hazards you have to consider and at what level and what tests to perform as well. And there are classifications related to protection against electric shock. So there is power source class, and then there's applied parts. So if you have applied parts, type B, BF, or CF, and applied part examples are included in some of the next slides. Then there's IP classification. So it's basically IP and 2 numbers. And that's protection against harmful ingress of water or particulates. This is not only medical device specific. There, your watch, for example, can have IP classification. So it means basically that can you submerge it or can you use it in a rainy condition, not just indoors. Method of sterilization is also one type of classification. It also affects some of the requirements of the standard. Transportability, that is also included in the next slide examples. So we'll get back to that. Also mode of operation, so is it continuous or non-continuous? And then there might be some special conditions like devices that can be used in oxygen-rich environments. So those are very specific cases then, and those have their specific requirements. And as promised, applied parts is one of the classifications that we'll look at in more detail. So it's basically part of medical electrical equipment that in normal use necessarily comes into physical contact with the patient for this device to perform its function. And patient connection is an individual point on the applied part through which current can flow between the patient and ME equipment in normal condition or single fault condition. So patient connection is sort of a subclass of this applied part. And then any other surface parts that are not applied parts are enclosures in the standard. And why these are handled separately, it's because parts that contact patients can present greater hazards than other parts of the enclosure. So of course the biocompatibility that we discussed in first part of the presentation is one of those hazards that they may present, but there are others as well related to electrical safety or electric shock hazards, for example. So they are subject to stricter requirements like temperature limits, leakage current. And then the types of applied parts are B, BF, and CF, and they are identified by these icons or on the labeling on the right. So type B, a body, is something that's not normally conductive and can be immediately released from the patient. So this could be LED operating lighting, MRI body scanners, hospital beds. Type BF, so body floating, is applied parts that have conductive contact with the patient or have medium or long-term contact with the patient. So blood pressure monitors, incubators, ultrasound equipment. And for home use, so if you have defined that you must follow the -11 standard that was for devices for home use, then type BF is minimum for any applied parts. So for those you cannot kind of use the type B. Type CF is cardiac floating, so these are applied parts that may come into direct contact with the heart, like dialysis machines. And then, of course, when you have defined these and you continue on in the standard, you will notice that there are different requirements for these 3 types because, of course, the risk level. And then back to this image that we already went through in the ME equipment, ME system example. So here it's marked that applied part and parts that have to be treated as applied parts would be these ECG electrodes and this cable up to that point where it divides from 1 to 3. And these are the parts that need to physically contact the patient in normal use. But then in risk management, you might also identify other parts of the patient cable that must be treated as applied parts. So if you, for example, determine that even from the point onwards, where it's just one cable, that there is still very high probability that it comes into contact with the patient, you might decide that you need to treat that as an applied part as well. But here probably they have treated it so that only the ECG electrodes necessarily come into contact, and then those 3 cables most likely come into contact, but probably from that connector on it then doesn't. But this depends on your definitions and your risk management file. And the ECG electrodes here would be classified as patient connections then as well. And transportability was one of the classifications in the standard, and these are in 2 main categories. So stationary, so once installed in place, is not intended to be moved, and transportable, that is intended to be moved from one place to another. So under stationary, there's also a subcategory of fixed. So it has been permanently attached to a specific location, or at least it needs tools to be removed from that location. Then there's under transportable, multiple different subcategories. So mobile, transportable equipment that once installed and placed into service is intended to be moved while supported by its own wheels or equivalent means. So it doesn't. This is one definition that people usually get confused about, because mobile here does not, of course, relate to things like mobile phones, but instead to something that moves on wheels. So mobile phones, on the other hand, would go into the portable category. So it's intended to be moved from one location to another while being carried. So it doesn't have its own wheels or similar. And then there is under portable, this category of body worn. So it's being worn by the patient or attached to patient's clothing. And then there's this quite difficult to see category handheld. So it means that it's something that's intended to be supported by hand. And this category overlaps multiple of these. And the reason why it also overlaps stationary and fixed equipment is because you might have a fixed equipment and then remote control is attached to it by cable. And that is the part that you are holding in your hand. So that is the handheld part. And then if you are going over the requirements and the test requirements, and you have, of course, all the requirements for the fixed equipment, but then you also need to consider for that remote part those handheld equipment test criteria and requirements. And then these definitions would, for example, affect this table. So mechanical strength test applicability. So which mechanical strength tests you would need to do. So for handheld, you would need to do push drop and molding stress relief test. And then again, for something like mobile, it would do push impact, rough handling, and molding stress relief. So this is just one point and example in the standard where any classification affects what you need to do or what you need to test. One thing to note about the standard is that in the chapter about labels and information and things like that, it also gives requirements for indicator lights. So if you are going to use any indicator lights, then do note that these have been determined in the standard. So if you use any lights, indicator lights, you must comply with these definitions. So if you have a red light, that's always a warning, and immediate response by operator is required. And if you have a yellow light, it's caution, prompt response by the operator is required. And green light is ready for use. So you cannot have, for example, a yellow light just indicating that that something is on or something is being charged, for example. And if any other colors than red, yellow, or green are used, their meaning must be other than what is specified here for red, yellow, and green. So if you use a blue light, it cannot mean that it's ready for use or that it's a warning or caution. And then you also must explain the meaning of these lights in the instructions for use, even if you are using red, yellow, and green according to this instruction. So it must be made sure that the user is aware as well. And then a couple of slides about electromagnetic compatibility. So as was mentioned, it's its own collateral standard, -2. And it has requirements and tests for susceptibility and immunity from electromagnetic disturbances. So it defines immunity thresholds intended to protect this medical device from electromagnetic interference that is caused by other devices that are used in the same room. And then emissions thresholds that limit a device's ability to generate its own potentially harmful EMC, so it cannot disturb other devices. So it's protection both ways. So this helps minimize potential for device malfunction that could place patients and healthcare providers at risk. And you must note that even if it's okay that your device is disturbed, it must still be made absolutely sure that it won't disturb these high risk, like life-sustaining devices, depending, of course, where it is used. So it has this definition of environment of intended use that we have an example of in the next slide. And same principles apply then for all other 60601 standards. So it must be made part of risk management as well. So here are the use environments and those immunity levels and requirements are based on which one of these you select. So is it professional healthcare environment like physician offices, dental offices, hospitals? Is it home healthcare environment? And this also includes many other places than home, but are from healthcare perspective, similar to home. So shops, markets, schools, libraries, vehicles, bus stations, airports, hotels. And then there are special environment with of course the strictest requirements. So military areas, heavy industrial areas, medical treatment areas with high powered ME equipment. So high frequency surgical equipment, shortwave therapy, RF shielded room of magnetic resonance imaging, things like this. And yeah, I should add that when you are designing your EMC testing, this is really something where you should be extra careful, because then when your device goes into testing, the actual certification testing, then if there are any problems, it's basically back to the drawing room, and it can be very costly. So if you have multiple different pieces of equipment, or even adapter and a piece of equipment, it's not sometimes very easy to get those compatible for the requirements. So it's not a plus minus calculation when you're taking into account multiple different equipment. So it can sometimes be quite surprising, but you should really do pre-testing and be quite mindful of this. So it's not one of those parts where you can parts of the standards where it's mostly just testing. So it's very needs expertise to do this. And a couple of words about CB scheme. So IECEE has this certification body scheme that allows recognition of single certification for worldwide market access. So this basically means that that IEC standard, or the standard series, have been implemented quite widely in the world. So US, Canada, Brazil, Europe, they are basically using the same standard, but there are some national deviations, because, for example, electrical outlets are giving out different voltage. So there are these minor deviations, but this CB schemes allows you to do all those delta tests already for multiple countries, and you can select which countries you want access to. So it's easier to do that already if you know that you are going to at some point go to market in this and this place. So that is something that is good to know. And there are multiple places that offer testing for the standard series, and SGS is one example in Finland. But it's a quite common topic, so shouldn't be difficult to find one near your location. And then this is not actually any more related to that standard, but a reminder about RED. So that is Radio Equipment Directive. This is closely related to medical electrical equipment, because it might also be considered as radio equipment. So you must know that if it's a radio equipment, then you also need to comply with this other directive, and not just the medical device directive, medical device regulation, and this is CE marking directive as well. So you need to comply with it, and you need to include it in your declaration of conformity. And the definition of radio equipment from the directive is basically here, but it means any devices with these capabilities, so not just radio, also Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, etc. And then it would mean that if you need to comply with this as well, then there are extra standards, extra tests for that radio part, basically. And then another reminder about another directive, so RoHS directive. So if you are manufacturing something that is in scope of this standard series, you are also most likely in scope of RoHS directive, and that is CE marking directive as well. So exception is active implantable medical devices, but that wasn't in scope of 60601 either, as we went through in the scope section, so that had its own standard. But RoHS is restriction of hazardous substances, and basically it means that you cannot use lead, mercury, hexavalent chromium, or mercury in your products, or these brominated, two categories of brominated polymers, or for phthalates. And it has been updated a couple of times. So this naming, sometimes they are speaking about RoHS, RoHS 2 and RoHS 3, not always, but the main thing for medical devices to know here is that the RoHS 3 that has the added for phthalates is coming into force for medical devices from July this year. So it's already in force for medical devices for those 6 other substances or categories of substances, but then those phthalates will also be in force for medical devices from this July onwards. And there are, of course, multiple exemptions where you can use, for example, lead. So there are 2 annexes in the directive. And the same thing as with red. So you would also then, when you comply with this, add this to your declaration of conformity as well. And that is the end of my presentation.